So hello there! Today we are going to talk about intercoolers in this next part of our ultimate Miata Turbo guide. And yeah, as you can see, we have everything to discuss right here. First of all, intercoolers, then piping, blow-off valves, and yeah, we are going to start with the piping. Obviously, getting the air from your turbo to your intake is the most important part to, well, achieve more power. And you could do this obviously without an intercooler, but the problem is that intake temperatures will rise very drastically, and even at 5 to 6 psi you would see about 80 degrees Celsius pretty fast, and that 80 degrees Celsius is also quite a heavy reduction in O2 molecules in that air. So the engine can produce less horsepower with that air as it would with an intercooler, for example. So you might want to think about it, even on a low budget system, to build something that you can use an intercooler, because it makes quite a big difference. Also, the knock resistance of engines with intercoolers is much higher, because the cooler the air, the more knock resistant the fuel air mixture is going to be. This is why we are discussing how big you should do your tubes or your routing, and how big your intercooler actually should be, and for what power level you need which size. Starting with the intercooler piping size. The diameter is not really that important, as you can even push like 600 horsepower through a normal 2-inch intercooler piping system, but I would only recommend the 2-inch from the turbo outlet to the intercooler, and then going the throttle body diameter from the intercooler to the throttle body. The reason on an MX-5 to go with a 2-inch system on the hot side is because you don't have much room with power steering and stuff. You will be able to fit 2-inch much easier than 2.5-inch. This is also why many kits, for example the Kraken Turbo kit, which is very good and does work very well, uses a 2-inch kit on the hot side, especially when using AC and power steering combined. Obviously, when only using power steering, you can use 2.5-inch, but it's not a must, since 2-inch can support up to 600 horsepower. From the cold side, I would always suggest using the diameter of at least the output of the intercooler, and best case is using the throttle body diameter, so that the air has enough room to expand to that diameter, and this would be the best case scenario. I would also suggest that on the hot side, when going out of the turbocharger, you don't have a direct 90 bend out of it, because going from the turbocharger to the piping, the air is going to have the most velocity and the most pressure, and this is why it very often happens that the couplers will blow off the turbocharger, or will burst even, or it will just hinder your performance somewhat, because it does actually give you some back pressure in the intercooler system. So I would suggest, as I've done here, using a straight bit downward from the turbocharger. As you can see here, for the Miata intercooler system, you basically need a bit of straight pipe, obviously, and you need at least 1, 2, 3, 2.5-inch 90-degree bends. It's not that complicated actually, and 2 or 3 90-degree bends on the hot side. It also depends on how big your intercooler is and what turbo you're using. In this case, this is probably the most efficient way. I have used a silicone coupler here as well, because that makes the whole system a bit more flexible than just using a straight pipe. Installation is way more easy. And one important thing I would also suggest on every pipe you use, or if you use just simple aluminum elbows and then just use a lot of couplers, that when you cut the elbow or a pipe, use either a bead roller to roll a bead around the end to secure the hose clamps onto, or at least if you are welding one up like I did here, just do some spot welds around the pipe so that the coupler can't slip off easily. Because if you don't do that, even at like 10 psi or something, possibly the couplers will slip off even under, like, as I said, low boost. On the throttle bodies on the MX-5 side, you need a pretty sharp 90-degree bend. No, you won't get away with a not as sharp of a bend. You need a really tight 90 elbow. I have used the FMIC 90-degree elbows and cut them down a bit, and they work quite well. I have had good luck with them, but as I said, it can be quite tight, so look for one that is relatively sharp in radius. For the blow-off, it is of course kind of a taste thing. Many people seem to love the sound of turbochargers without blow-off valves. I also do like the sound, but the problem is that on a lot of turbochargers, they seem to die very quickly when not using a blow-off valve. The problem with that is when running high pressures, like over 1 bar or 40 psi, the thrust load on the bearings from the turbocharger is very high without a blow-off, and that damages them, and so they don't last very long. Though you can run a blow-off valve that has a spring in it, such as this one. This is a blow-off valve where you have boost reference, or rather vacuum on this side, and you have a spring in here, and also have an aluminum piston in there that when vacuum is applied here and the excess pressure in the boost pipes is pushing up, then this piston is going to move upwards, and on really low boost levels this isn't going to even open, so you still have some flutter when the turbo is producing only, like, say up to 6 to 7 pounds. But when on higher boost pressures, like 14 psi or whatever, this is gonna open and is not going to strain your turbocharger as much. Obviously, it's kind of a taste thing. You can obviously use like a HKS SSQV style blow-off or whatever you like. You can also recirculate your blow-off, obviously, if you don't like the noise. But then I would really suggest putting the blow-off on the cold side of the piping, because putting the blow-off on the hot side and recirculating it, you would recirculate the hot air back into your intake. So just do it that way. It's much better for the engine and will also aid in some power gains, or rather no power losses. As I said, I've chosen this one. This is a unit from Pulsar, costs about 60 bucks and is pretty much bulletproof. I have purchased also a stainless steel flange because my piping is stainless steel. I cannot work with aluminum yet, so I have to work with stainless steel since I only have a DC welder, but doesn't make much of a difference, just in weight. And yeah, this is why I've gone for that. And now we're coming to the intercooler part itself. For the intercoolers themselves, there are quite a lot of options, but since they are only around 40 bucks difference price-wise, I would always suggest going at least for this one. This is the 450 width by 230 height model, which can be had for around 120 euros or bucks from fmic.eu. And this is basically the one I would always suggest, because the one that's a bit smaller is only like 10 bucks less. Yes, obviously it is a bit easier to fit, not much, doesn't make much of a difference, but a bit. And that is also the smaller one is the one used by Kraken, for example. But I would suggest using this one because of the more rows you have from the intercooler. That also means that the back pressure, when the air comes in and has to use all of the room that's here, it has more space to use and less back pressure to go through the intercooler, and therefore will lose less pressure going all the way through, because it has basically just more surface area. Also has more surface area for cooling, but the problem is here that the MX-5, like the intake, is only going to about here, so it does not make much difference for cooling. It's only the only thing that could be argued that it is the thermal mass of the bigger intercooler that's beneficial, but not really the surface area, the frontal surface area. The outlets are 63 millimeters or 2.5 inch, which I would always suggest because it's just the most common. There are 3-inch options, but you'd have to reduce back down to 2.5 inch, and reducers are obviously more expensive than couplers. So just use this one, will be good to go. I'll also link this in the description. This core is capable of around 500 horsepower, I think. Also depends on the boost pressure. The higher the pressure, the bigger the intercooler has to be. That's why diesel cars are running so big of an intercooler, or even water method injection. But as I said, 500 horsepower on this core shouldn't be a problem. The small size coolers you see on some cars, I wouldn't even suggest them because they are often very cheaply made and they are not that much cheaper, and the fitting them is also not that much easier. Also building the system out of pipes is basically the same thing because you have to go around the radiator, so it doesn't make much of a difference. Just choose this one, it's your best choice, and you will get, as a bit of a bonus, better cooling obviously. And then there are monstrosities like this one. Well, obviously you probably won't find this in an MX-5, although this is probably going to be enough. Well, FMIC says it will be enough for about 1200 horsepower. I would say it's around 1000, but still, this core is, for example, I'd say, yeah, pretty good 1000 horsepower core, and you would find this basically in, for example, Mark IV Supra with a 2JZ, or for example, some very high boost builds. You would also probably be able to fit this in an MX-5 somehow, but there would be a lot of cutting involved. I just wanted to show you what sizes there are for intercoolers, and yeah, this is pretty massive. It's a 600 by 300 height core, and it's 100 millimeters thick. For context, the other one was 65. So this is really, really big. It's very massive. And obviously a bigger intercooler is gonna give you a less of a pressure drop across. If you run like 30 psi and you go off of the turbo itself for that pressure reference, you might only see 25 or 26 psi at your inlet manifold. And with the bigger intercooler, because the surface area I talked about before is bigger, your pressure drop off across the intercooler might be lower. So you might see 2 psi more or whatever. So that also can help somewhat. It's not really that big of an issue, because if the pressure drop is just 1 or 2 psi higher, the turbocharger just has to work a bit harder, which is not that big of a deal for most units. But yeah, that's just an option you have. As for some people say that you have a lot of lag if you have a very big intercooler, I would suggest that this is kind of not really true, because a turbocharger is going to produce so much air that it's going to fill this volume. Even this big of a volume is going to be filled by a TD04 turbocharger which is a very small unit at way less than half a second. So even this monstrosity of an intercooler would not be a problem for basically any engine. And yeah, that's basically it as for intercoolers. I hope it helped you somewhat. If you have any questions about this topic, yeah, leave them in the comments below. And otherwise, I wish you a nice day and goodbye.